out for whatever reason somehow. They go back to work on Monday, and then that person dumps on them their weekend's problems, and then all week again. And you can keep taking that person's crap and making them feel better. And that, all the power to you. But unless they change their circumstances, you're always just going to be a dumping ground. You're better off to just not protect yourself from them and not go around them until they fix their problems. And that means you have to tell them that, and they stop talking to you. Well, then that's a win-win probably, because then maybe they might get in their head they got to fix their problems, and they're going to stop coming around you. That's the same thing with healing magic. You want to heal somebody who's sick, who's not going to change their ways. Well, then it may not be possible. But if they are the person who's willing to get this information, well, then you get this information to them, and you can do some of the healing shit that I've already talked about, Archangel Raphael sigils and different magics, and any magic I've ever taught you on here. Candle magic. I am so grateful for blah, 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 blah. Make sure you use the right corresponding person. Like if Mercury is in Scorpio, not retrograde, going straight, is one of the best times to do healing magic. Depending on the person or whatever is going on, making candles to them and completely having complete faith that it's going to happen. Getting that into your subconscious, into your reality. But keep in mind, everybody else's mind focusing on that person being sick plays a part into this. Sometimes you might have to do magic to get their minds off of it. Get everything obstructing him from, like a road opener almost, for healing. Get rid of all the obstructions that are in the way for this person to receive the healing they need. Stuff like that. Do those first and just make it a candle. I'm so grateful this person's healed. Knowing specifically what's wrong with them and using the right words also comes into play there. But anyways, I had to get into some Jerry Tennant, and this is one of my first healing episodes I ever made on my podcast. So yeah, thanks for tuning in.
To move over and take out the next circuit. So a huge problem is that our kids are in high school, they go to the dentist and they say, oh, you got to get your wisdom teeth out. It's that old thing of, well, if you go to Midas, you get a muffler. So a study came out last year showing that 65% of root canal extractions were unnecessary. Well, nevertheless, they get their wisdom teeth pulled, and now they start getting infection in that area. And the wisdom teeth circuit is heart, small intestine, but listen, it's the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system is the body's on-off switches. So all of a sudden, within days after getting their wisdom teeth extracted, the kids have lost their on-off switch, which means their body doesn't know how to control itself. Then over time, it begins to move next door and takes out the spleen stomach circuit. Now remember that the spleen circuit is the power supply to the adrenal glands. So now soon they've lost their control panel, their on-off system, and then they lose their adrenals, so they can't deal with stress, and so they began to become what many people say, oh, he's just a teenager. Well, no, he's not just a teenager. He's lost his ability, the whole way the body deals with stress. And so many of our kids hide themselves within electronics, because within the electronics, they have an on-off switch. In their body, they don't. So they can't deal with the real world anymore. And so they hide within their cell phone and their Game Boys or whatever you call them. Nevertheless, this is a huge problem. Now, when you lose, I only got 5 minutes left. So when you lose your ability to make adrenaline, you go down the following slippery slope. You have trouble going to sleep. You have trouble dealing with stress. You have trouble with your memory. And then you can't multitask. So you're sitting reading a book or watching TV and somebody says, hey, do you want mustard or mayonnaise? You become very annoyed because they interrupted you. But you don't have the mental horsepower to stay attached to whatever you're doing, so you detach, you pick mustard, you go back to your book, and now you can't remember your place, and you're even more annoyed. And then it gets to where you don't like any stimulus, so you don't like loud noises, loud music, rowdy crowds, can't be around people who are arguing. And eventually it gets to where you don't even want to be touched, you just want to sit in the corner and have people leave you the heck alone. And then your sexual equipment quits working. And then you can't go to sleep before 11, and when you wake up, you're still tired. All of that's due to the loss of the spleen power supply to your adrenals. Well, what I've just described, of course, is very destructive. if you can't deal with the life of the world, you can't be a good spouse, and particularly if your sexual equipment doesn't work anymore, then that's a big problem in a marriage. You can't be a good parent because kids make noise and want something from you, and you have nothing to give. You can't be a good worker. You can't be a good friend. You can't be good at much of anything, so your life's in the toilet simply because you've lost the spleen circuit that goes to the adrenal glands. And that's a huge problem in our society. Well, now, Eileen McCusick spoke earlier about mapping the field of emotions, and this is the traditional Chinese one, so that the various circuits have these various sorts of emotions get stuck in these various particular places or in the teeth that are associated with these. Dr. Banas published these, and of course, Eileen has published hers, which is this group of where things get stuck. And as far as erasing emotions are concerned, because emotions are a magnetic field, you can erase them with a stronger magnetic field. One of the laws of physics is if you take any magnet and you put a stronger magnet over it, then the weaker magnet assumes the characteristics of the stronger one. And so when you have these emotions that are stuck, you can begin to erase them in a variety of different ways. Now, there are various groups over the years that have looked at this subject and tried to figure out how to do it. EFT, Psych-K, emotion code, psychosomatic energetics, et cetera, et cetera. But certainly, we had developed one where you can, if you can think about emotion while holding onto these hand grips with your biomodulator, you could erase the emotion. But when we did that, we were doing in one emotion at the time. And of course, Eileen talked to you this morning about using her tuning fork to do it, which is very effective. What I have recently found is that if you treat the wisdom teeth, which treats your autonomic nervous system, then you can begin to knock out, you can not only change the polarity in all of your various circuits at one time, but also knock out many of the motions automatically. Now, a pendulum is actually like a single string on a guitar, and the weight on the pendulum makes the string taut. So when it's moved, it's actually resonating with whatever frequency the string is. So what you do is you hold this pendulum over the small intestine, small intestine autonomic system, and you take the biotransducer and simply put it over the wisdom teeth, and you watch the pendulum, and it'll always be spinning backwards if the voltage is low, counterclockwise, and you keep holding it there, and pretty soon it'll slow down, and then it'll start spinning clockwise. And then you do the same on the other side, again, holding the pendulum over the hard small intestine circuit, put the biotransducer over the autonomic system where you can access it with the tooth, watch it spin backwards and in the correct way, and now when you go back and check all of the circuits, you've corrected the polarity in every circuit, and many of the emotions that you had found out in the biofield are already gone as well. So, unfortunately, I don't have the time to talk to you about how we're wired up with polarity and with how our body's all golden mean and how implosion occurs. If you're interested in those subjects, then we have some videos that will help you in that area. Plus, we'll be giving some demonstration. If there are any of you in the audience who happen to have an emotion, anybody here? We'll be doing some demonstrations in the breakout room. So what I've hoped to accomplish in these few minutes I had to talk with you is to help you understand that the body is an electronic device which has multiple battery packs, and the chronic disease occurs when those battery packs won't hold a charge, and that getting well involves you identifying which battery packs are failing you, identifying the reason that they're failing you, and fixing that, so that it's basically what we're doing is like you coming home from work and opening the fridge, and it's hot in there, and the lamp in the living room won't turn on, the TV in the bedroom won't turn on, and you go out in the garage and flip the circuit breaker, and now everything works. Well, that's the way we do medicine now, is we figure out which circuit breaker is out, will fix it, turn you back on, and let your body heal itself, which it does very well if it has the voltage, the nutrients, and deal with the toxins. Thank you for allowing me to be here. Back on and let your body heal itself, which it does very well if it has the voltage, the nutrients, and deal with the toxins. Thank you for allowing me to be here. I want to have special medical boards for integrative medicine and homeopathic medicine, and I'm licensed under that Arizona Board of Integrative and Homeopathic Medicine, and that's the license that I have this conversation under, and not my Texas license. I'm trained as an ophthalmologist and did traditional ophthalmology with a focus on cataract surgery for 30 years or so. I had a lot of fun being an ophthalmologist. I was able to do a lot of things that changed the way ophthalmology is practiced. I had a great deal to do with bringing intraocular lenses into this country, or the use of them. When I was trained, we would simply take the lens out of the eye, and people would end up wearing really big, thick glasses. Of course, those allowed you to see, but they were fairly disabling because everything looked 30% too big and 30% too close, and it was hard to walk or drive or whatever. So I was one of the early people to put lenses in eyes after cataract surgery. And then there were some problems with the European lenses that we used in the beginning, so I modified those and got lenses to work better, and then began to teach others how to do that. So that was one of the fun things I did. When I was trained, we kept patients in the hospital for 2 weeks with both eyes blinded, and of course, the elderly tend to become disoriented and even psychotic if you keep them in bed and blind them for a couple of weeks. So I developed a way to make a watertight incision so that they didn't have to stay in bed, and we could actually get them up and walk them immediately from the surgery table, and that changed a lot of things as well. And also we had a problem with people, the elderly, going into the hospitals. You know, elderly people have a tendency to get a particular pattern of living. They eat certain things that agree with them and that keep their digestive and urinary processes working. There are foods that upset them, and so you put them in a hospital and change all of that. They commonly get sick just from being inside their normal environment, and often fall and hurt themselves. One of the things we began then to work on was outpatient surgery. So being able to operate on cataract and then have people go immediately home was a great benefit, and we helped, along with my anesthesiologist and internist, develop the techniques for that and taught how to do that. And I guess the next thing I did in ophthalmology that was kind of fun is I did the majority of the research for the laser that's used in LASIK surgery. So I did about 90% of that research for the company called WITCHCRAFT. But during that process of doing the laser surgery, we didn't know that the laser wouldn't kill viruses. And so I was using the laser to carve the scar off of the cornea of a fellow from India that had leukemia. And it carved the scar off well enough, but it also released viruses from his cornea.
I have to get my suit on for a rough estimate.
That went into my nose. And that went into my nose and into my brain, and I got encephalitis. And so I got to where I could see a patient, know what was wrong with them, but I couldn't remember how to write a prescription. I also developed spastic movements, so I'd be sitting there and all of a sudden I'd do something like that, which doesn't work really well if you're operating inside somebody's eyeball. And I had overwhelming fatigue. And so for all those reasons, I had to quit work at the end of November of 1995. And so I slept 16 hours a day.
had 2 or 3 hours a day in which I could understand a newspaper, and then like a light switch would go off and I couldn't understand it anymore. I went to the best doctors I could find in Boston and New York, et cetera, and they all said, well, you have 3 viruses in your brain. We don't know what to do about it. Good luck. So during that 2 or 3 hours a day I could think, I had to figure out how to get myself well. And so I began the journey of trying to figure out how I might do that. And one of the things that resonated with me was that every cell in the body had the same hardware. Even though cells look quite different, just like a laptop looks different than a desktop computer, they still have all the same basic parts. And I thought, well, if I can figure out how to make one cell work, I can make them all work. And so I started down that road, and I bought a bunch of cellular biology books, which I hadn't read in 30 years, and began to read through them. And one of the things that resonated with me is said that cells have to run at a pH of 7.35 to 7.45. Well, I didn't really remember much about pH except it was acid-base balance. But as an eye surgeon, I didn't really need to know much about that for 30 years. And so I began to study pH and discovered that pH is simply the measurement of voltage in a liquid. If you think about a copper wire, you turn the switch on, the electrons flow, you turn the switch off, and they stop. But in a liquid, it can either be an electron donor or an electron stealer. And by convention, if the liquid is an electron stealer, you put a plus sign in front of the voltage. And if it's an electron donor, you put a minus sign in front of the voltage. By convention also, you take the voltage and you convert it to a logarithmic scale from 0 to 14 and call it pH. So plus 400 millivolts of electron stealer is the same as a pH of 0. And minus 400 millivolts of electron donor is the same as a pH of 14. When you read then that cells have to run at a pH of 7.35 to 7.45, that's a synonym of minus 20 to minus 25 millivolts, give or take a millivolt. So I said, oh, cells have to have voltage to work. That makes sense. And so all of a sudden, this new way of thinking about things was obvious to me. The next issue was, how do you measure it? Well, of course, if you take a standard pH meter, it has a switch on it. You can switch it from pH or millivolts, whichever one you want to have it read out. And you simply stick the probe in a liquid and it'll tell you what the pH is or what the millivolts is and or convert it to the logarithmic scale of pH for you. So I said, well, how do you measure it in the body? And I found that a chap named Nakatani was the first person to use modern electronics to measure acupuncture circuits, and published in 1951. So I got his rather rudimentary equipment, started measuring, and where my brain should be running at minus 25 millivolts, I found it was running between minus 2 to minus 4 millivolts. So then I knew why it didn't work. Didn't have the juice to do it. So the next issue is, well, what am I going to do about it? So I began to do some more reading and found that a Russian chap had figured out the waveform that would more efficiently transfer electrons to cell membranes. I began to try to learn about that and discovered that there was a Russian pediatrician named Zulia Valieva Frost. Zulia Valieva married a chap from London named Frost and had moved to London. And she was in the process of teaching people how to use this Russian device to transfer energy to cells. So I called her and I said, hey, I'm interested in what you're doing. And she said, well, as luck would have it, I'm teaching my first seminar in San Francisco in 3 days. I said, sign me up, I'll be there. So I went to that seminar and got the Russian device and began to recharge my cells. And in about 6 weeks or so, things began to get better. The other thing that happened about that time was that I was on an airplane and there was a nurse sitting next to me from this Dallas area. And she began to tell me that she had lymphoma, had this big tumor around her neck and scattered throughout her body, and that she had gone to Mexico, and in a matter of days the tumors were gone, even though MD Anderson had told her to go home and die. So I went down to visit with the docs that helped her to see how in the world they did that. And that was sort of the beginning of my journey, along with this other business of the electronics, to figure out how to get well. And one of the things they taught me was that essentially all tumors are associated with infection in your teeth, particularly root canal teeth. And so she had gone down and they had pulled her root canal tooth and cleaned up the infection in her mouth, and in a matter of days her tumors were gone. And she sent me not only photographs, but she sent me her medical records from MD Anderson of when she came back, and they proved that her tumors had disappeared. So I had a root canal tooth here in what's called the spleen stomach acupuncture circuit. And so my docs here in Dallas said there's nothing wrong with that tooth. But I'd also developed a bleeding disorder, and so I went back down to Mexico and had the dentist that had operated on this nurse work on me. And when she pulled that tooth, there was so much infection in the bone, it splattered all over her mask. And yet I had no symptoms as far as the tooth was concerned. But 48 hours after she pulled the tooth, my bleeding disorder was cured. And that was rather amazing. And then over the next 6 weeks or so, my brain started to work again. And so that's how I started going down this road of figuring out how the body really works and what the role of voltage is in the body, because it's obviously so different than what I was taught in medical school. One of the things that I was led to try to understand was acupuncture. Actually, that was part of a bigger picture in that I was sitting in my chair at home and I said to myself, well, obviously traditional medicine that I was taught told me go home and die. And so that obviously wasn't working so well. But that sometimes chiropractic works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes acupuncture works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes essential oils work, sometimes they doesn't, et cetera, et cetera. So there are all these various medical models that sometimes work and sometimes don't. So my thinking was, if I could figure out, there has to be a common denominator that goes through all of these. Otherwise, because, I mean, if things work, it's because it's following some basic laws, some basic rules of how things are supposed to work. If I could figure out what that common denominator was running through all of these different paradigms, then I'd know how to get myself well. And it began to become apparent to me that the voltage piece was the common denominator for all of these things. Now, obviously it becomes very complicated when you start, particularly someone like me who has no background in electronics or even in physics. I had, freshman college physics, and that was my background. The issue is, how do you figure out what the common denominator is? And I began to go down a different road in that I began to understand that there's no such thing as a bunch of little balls of electrons spinning around a charged ball in the center. It's been known for probably 75 years or so that that's really not what an atom is, but that we still teach that. And so I began to read and talk to, I fortunately was able to talk to some various people who had gone down that road before me and began to understand more about what an atom is, because if you don't understand what energy is, what an atom is, even how the universe works, you can't understand how a cell works. And so I began to consider that there were alternatives. So one of the things that was a great influence on me was the work of Schauberger, in the Swiss water specialist who had figured out how to make a flying saucer that was fueled by water. And he was captured by Hitler, as you probably know, and made to make us work in that industry for the Germans. He understood very, very well that there are things that spin right and concentrate the energy into a point, which of course we call implosion, and there's something that spins left that starts small and gets bigger and then disappears, we call an explosion, and that those are the two basic kinds of energy. Schauberger's work with water and energy was very influential on my road down trying to figure out how the body works. The other thing that was very powerful was to read the work that that muscles are piezoelectric. And so I began to consider, and I was initially wrong. I thought our muscles were wired up the way a 12-volt battery is. You know, you take the cover off of a 12-volt battery, and there are a bunch of 1.5-volt batteries all wired together in there. And I thought that's the way our body was wired up, that our muscles were just one big battery that provided power for the cells to work. But then I began to notice that there were patients that had normal total body voltage as I measured it, but there would be one circuit out or one organ out. And I said, well, then I have to be wrong about how we're wired up. And I began to consider that acupuncture meridians were stacks of muscle batteries wired together into one single column that provided power. And I was talking with one of my colleagues, Dr. Evans, about this, and he said, well, have you read Tom Myers' book, Anatomy Trains? And I said, no, I never heard of it. And he said, well, you should read it. So I get Myers' book, and Myers is a massage therapist who had access to cadavers. And he would use blunt dissection and started dissecting the fascia and discovered that it would go all the way from the toe.
The emotion is the root cause that eventually will cause the voltage in that tooth to drop, and then the tooth will eventually get decayed and go down that pathway. And then, of course, the things we've discussed will, where you have lack of voltage, then lack of oxygen, then the voltage continues to drop, the cell wall deficient organisms show up, etc. So what we found is that if we remove the emotional blockage and you still fail the O-ring test, you likely have infection in the bone. But if you remove the emotion and now the O-ring test goes from abnormal back to normal, one can make the assumption that the problem was the emotional blockage. Now, different researchers have identified which emotions are stored in which circuits. Traditional Chinese medicine says that anger is stored in the liver gallbladder, fear in the bladder, worry in the spleen stomach, lack of joy in the heart small intestine, grief in the lung large intestine, anxiety in the parasympathetic and sympathetic systems. Dr. Vanis suggested a different set of observations about which emotions are stored in which circuits, and he published that in his book, New Life Through Energy Healing. Eileen Magick developed what is called biofield tuning, and this is her observations of which emotions get stuck in which circuits. Another thing that's interesting that Magick has noted is that if you have an emotion that's related to your father, it tends to get stuck on the right side of your body. And if it's related to your mother, it tends to get stuck on the left side of your body. So sometimes you'll find that you have a circuit that is normal on one side and